Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes. I am the author of the newly released book, The Only Witness, A History of the Shroud of Turin. It is a historical fiction tracing a possible yet plausible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we're speaking with Joe Marino, and he is a well-known Shroud researcher and has a very interesting connection to the Shroud. And today we're going to be talking about some of the things around the carbon-14 dating and other dating aspects and what have you. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Joe. Joe has a BA in Theological Studies from St. Louis University, and he's a longtime syndenologist, which is someone that studies the Shroud of Turin. He's researched, written, and lectured extensively on the Shroud since 1977, and he currently works at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. As early as 1977, he became fascinated through a book he read, and since then he has been hooked on the further study of the Shroud. And I hate to say it, that it applies to all of us. I am now hooked as well. But in 1997, Marino received a call from Sue Benford, who informed him of her spiritual insights about the Shroud. And after many discussions via phone and email about the Shroud, he began to experience God in a whole new way. He felt powerfully drawn to leave the monastery and pursue Shroud research and other spiritual paths with Benford. So it is his hope and desire that their work and his work can get this message across. And it is his belief that this is the destiny to which he has been called, which is why he's been given the passion that he has for the Shroud of Turin. With that, thank you, Joe. So good to have you here today.
Thanks, Guy. It's always good to be with you.
Absolutely. And looking forward to our discussion. So anyway, let's get started. So now you've come up with a what's called a an invisible reweave theory on the Shroud and why it may have affected the dating of the Shroud that was done by the carbon-14 testing that we all kind of know about
Mhm.
from 1988. So tell us what that reweave theory is.
Okay. And just one correction in the bio, I'm happily retired from Ohio State University now. That's been a few years, and that, of course, enables me to do more shroud work, which is part of the idea of me retiring. Anyway, yeah, when I first got together with Sue, she noticed what she thought were some irregularities in the C14 corner. And as you mentioned, she also had some spiritual insights, and we started investigating that. And so the first thing we did was send pictures of the C14 sample to three textile experts, but did not tell them that they were pictures of the shroud, because once people know it's the shroud, you know, bias can creep in and whatnot. So we just showed them the close-ups of the pictures and said, just we'd like your observations on this. And all three independently, including one here in Columbus, who was he was born, I think, in France and was a tailor in Columbus, Ohio. And she visited him in person. The other two we did by mail. Um, but all three independently said that they felt that the area had been manipulated in some way. So we thought, well, that's interesting. So um, we later got quite a few other people that independently weighed in, and textile experts and chemists and different scientists and stuff, um, that seemed to indicate that they thought there was repairs or manipulations or anything. So I've written quite a few papers over the years, and I now have there's a technique that was known in France called French invisible reweaving. And interestingly, um, at the time that we believe the repairs were done, and let me say it's almost universally mentioned in articles and podcasts when people talk about it, that they think that the Poor Clare nuns who put the patches in after the fire of 1532. In 1534, they put in patches after the fire, and most of the people think that they did the French invisible reweave, which I don't think they did, because I think it's a very specialized technique, and I don't think they would have been talented enough to do that. And it's important to remember that at that time, the shroud was actually owned by Margaret of Austria, who was part of the House of Savoy, and she had access to the French weavers in her court, and so we believe one or more of her weavers in her court actually performed the repair. In 1508, she did her will and had something in there about giving it. The language, I think, is not clear. Is either a piece of the shroud or the whole shroud to a church, and then she died in 1530, and then the fire was in 1532. So we think that the invisible reweave was probably done, probably shortly before she died in 1530. And the French invisible reweave is a technique that it involves a really tedious and time-consuming thread by thread restoration. Now, when Sue and I first thought that there was a repair, we kind of thought that the first century cloth was here, and then the 16th century cloth was there, and they were next to each other. But then later on, we revised it, and then French invisible reweaving would have been thread by thread interweaving. And in fact, Ray Rogers did find later on cotton interspersed with linen. So I've got three along the way. I've discovered three different manuals of how to do French invisible reweaving, and there's some real interesting quotes about there. And I have those in my most recent paper that I put up on Academia, and they're saying, people, if you do it well, people won't be able to tell that you've done it, and there is some question about, some experts say that you might make it invisible on the top side, but not on the back side. But in that technique, there are no knots. So when you look at the backside, you're not going to see knots. And then most importantly, I mean, I think the evidence is, if you look at it overall, it's pretty compelling. And I think the most important aspect of it is that it's been confirmed chemically. If it's unless you're an expert, you're really not going to be able to tell with the naked eye if something there. So you have to go to the chemical level, and I have quotes from Adler and Rogers and different people that suggest that there is in fact an invisible reweave there.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and to your point, when I first heard about the reweave, I've had like suits, a hole in a suit repaired, and the fix is not bad on the one side, but then if you look at the other side, then you can see that there was like a patch of material, kind of like in your first example, there was a patch of material that was somehow woven in. But what you're saying is that the invisible, or this French invisible reweave, is actually thread by thread. So it sounds like you're joining. I don't know if you're cutting or whatever you're doing, but you're cutting and joining two different materials at some point, and then that new material then gets woven back in and into the original cloth. And so there's actually two things, or maybe even more, going on. There's actually the connection of the two threads so that you can't see that connection. And then the second piece, I guess, is then the actual weave pattern that then is replicated, and so that you can't even see the weave, the new weave pattern with that new thread. And that is that definitely is a very interesting task for somebody to take on. And to your point as well, I don't think the poor Claire's sisters would have been capable enough. That would, I mean, they may have been great sewers and tailors and whatever, but I think you're right. They have to, the person that did it actually has to be very, very proficient at doing that specific weave.
Right. And I wouldn't, as I mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a team of weavers rather than just one person working on it. And I should also point out that there was a Swiss archaeologist named Maria Grazia Ciliato who thinks that she lists in a book of hers, which, and I have the quote in my paper, she listed like 5 or 6 different other type of repair techniques. And if you think about it, over the centuries, the shroud being handled and being in the care of different people, it wouldn't be surprising that different techniques wouldn't be used over the centuries to help keep up the stability of the cloth. So not only did we think there was an invisible reweave, but we came to believe that there were other types of repairs as well, which makes it a little harder to figure out who did what and when. But the chemical evidence suggests there were repairs in that area.
Yeah, it's interesting too. And so one of the things you said was interesting as well, is that if there was a reweave and you sent 3 sample pictures of both sides to 3 separate textile experts, and their results were that there might have been some manipulation on those corners there.
Well, back in those days, this was in 2000, so we didn't have yet. We do now. There are pictures of the backside of the samples, but we didn't have access to them back then. We just had the front side. So, but they believed that there certainly was manipulation on the front side. And I checked with Pam Moon, who has done some good research. Actually sent both you and I some links to pictures of the backside of all 3 samples that the labs had, and she certainly believes she consulted an expert, textile expert named Donna Campbell from Irish, what's the name of it? Thomas Ferguson Limited, and she believes that there was not only an invisible reweave, but a contamination that might have the part of the reason for the reweave was to cover up mold that resulted from different contaminations that happened over the centuries as well.
Yeah, exactly. So she had a couple of things going on, but tell us why the corners, or why there might have been a reweave in those corners of the shroud.
Yeah, well, you can see if you look at different engravings and whatnot and illustrations of exhibitions over the years.
I have one right behind me.
Great. Yeah, the bishops are always holding up the top part of the shroud by the corners, and then those corners had a couple of the corners had areas cut out to give as relics. So once you cut on a fabric like that, if you don't, restore it properly, it begins to fray even more. So unfortunately, the main reason that they only took one sample, which was a crucial mistake for the C14, because it was suggested that they take it from multiple parts of the cloth. I mean, the shroud's 14.5 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. It's a big cloth. If you take one little sample from a corner that has probably been repaired, you have absolutely no guarantee that it's representative of the rest of the cloth. And no matter how much the skeptics argue, one sample is not sufficient, and it just isn't done on any object that I'm aware of. You have to have control samples. Oh, and get this as an aside. The Michael Tite of the British Museum told the C14 labs the dates of the control samples. Now, one of the main idea, I think, of a control sample is to make sure that these labs equipment is working properly. Okay, so if you give them three samples, control samples of known dates, and all three labs get the control sample dates wrong, you obviously can't trust what they get with the shroud. Now the problem becomes if you give them the dates of the control samples, and I'm not saying this happened, but there's the possibility that they will then manipulate the data to say, oh yes, our equipment, who's going to know? Our equipment was perfectly fine on the control samples. Well, no, that's not how it's done. You don't let the labs determine whether their equipment is accurate. That's the whole idea of a control sample. And so that was another big problem. But I'm getting off on a tangent and on a soapbox here. But anyway, so yeah, the corners were cut on to give away as relics, and they were always held by that corner. So and then Ganella picked that one corner, where the C14 sample was taken, because in 1973, that's where the so-called Reyes sample, that's Dr. Gilbert Reyes, was given a small sample in that corner for textile analysis. And they decided to take the C14 sample from that area because that area was already cut on, and they figure, well, let's not cut any additional spots since this, but that's just bad science. It's just bad science. So I think just on that the fact that it was taken from one sample site alone, disqualifies the validity of the results. Now the other side will argue that apparently because they're happy with the results, but from a pure scientific point of view, that was just bad science.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's hold our thought, our talking on that, because there's a couple of other things that I think also play in here. So first of all, we talked about what the French individual reweave is, and that it's not visible on either side, and that seems to be true based on the photos that Pam sent. Now there are a couple of other theories. So what we're trying to do is the carbon-14 came out with a date of the entire cloth based on this tiny sample from potentially a contaminated, manipulated corner of the cloth of 1260 to 1390. And so what that means is if the actual radiocarbon ratios and mechanism and measurements were done correctly, then that means that either the cloth is from that time period, 1260 to 1390, or there was contamination or manipulation, or there might have been another theory, which is the Robert Rucker neutron absorption theory. So let's talk about that one, and then we can talk about some things with Pam Moon as well. Maybe in one or two sentences, tell us what Robert Rucker kind of came up with and how that may differ then from what the invisible reweave might be.
Okay. So Bob's theory is that there was an emission of, I guess, neutrons. I get lost in all these.
It's neutrons. Yep.
So there was an emission of neutrons that was emitted from the body, for all intents and purposes, at the point of resurrection. I think he's very careful with his language because, he talks about he has a scientist hat and he is a Christian. So, but he talks about taking off his Christian hat and putting on a scientific hat. And I think it's a kind of a hard dichotomy to balance properly. But anyway, So he believes that based on calculations, he's an expert, he's a nuclear engineer and quite good with calculations and things. And he's been doing various computer calculations since I think about 2014. And he's determined that based on where the shroud would have been in the tomb and also the sidarium, which he thinks was to the side, that the neutron emissions skewed the C14 date, and in fact that's the sidarium of Oviedo dated to a different dates to like 700. And he thinks that that's consistent with his theory that if it was off to the side, it would have received a different amount of neutrons as opposed to the shroud. So he thinks that not only did the neutrons cause the image, but actually skewed the C14 date. And he believes his calculations are consistent and more or less prove that. But until we do some additional actual hands-on testing of the shroud, it's really only a hypothesis. And I don't think it can be really, I don't think there's going to be a consensus on that hypothesis being true until there's additional testing. But so his theory explains both the image formation and the skewing of the C14 date. Where I'm coming from is I'm not looking at image formation at all with this theory. I'm just looking at why the C14 dating came out medieval as opposed to first century if the shroud is authentic.
Yeah. So and the difference is what you're kind of saying, which and the thing is they're both, I think they're great. They're both great theories or hypotheses. And so in your case, what's happening is you have new material with a new date being mixed with old material with an old date, and that then the average of the two may have then led to the carbon-14 dating of the 1260 to 1390. Mm-hmm. The Rucker neutron absorption theory is then where neutrons were somehow bombarded into the atoms that were, or the carbon atoms that were there, and maybe there's nitrogen atoms as well, and that then led to a higher proportion of the carbon-14, right, which then led to the more recent dating of the shroud. And I'm wondering, do you think it's possible that both theories could be partially right, or I mean, and could coexist on the same material, or do you think it's exclusive?
Yeah, Bob, according to Bob's calculations, and I don't remember the details, but he thinks that his theory proves, because of a couple factors, he thinks that if his theory is right, the invisible reweave theory hypothesis cannot be right. So that's part of his theory. That again, that would be something that would have to be tested. But I just say, there's empirical evidence for their invisible reweave that's, I think, pretty solid, and you have to explain it. You've got all the ingredients in that corner. I mean, Rogers found a dye, cotton, and a mordant. And other people have confirmed, believe that as well. So you've got to explain why you have all the ingredients for a repair, but then how do you conclude that there's not a repair? You have to explain the scientific facts that suggest or indicate a repair. So, it depends on where you're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm fascinated by both of the theories, but it would be hard for me to believe that the Jews of that time would have used a cloth because it needs to be ceremonially clean. And ceremonially clean means it has to be 100% linen. It can't be, 50% or 20%
Mm-hmm.
cotton and 80% linen. It has to be as close as possible to 100%. And yet Ray Rogers did find those cotton,
Mm-hmm.
cotton threads in there. So it would be hard to believe that there would be that cotton contamination coming from, going back all the way to the
Mm-hmm.
original cloth. Now,
Right.
Pam Moon, who we've mentioned, she's actually, she's done a ton of research, and one of the things that I found fascinating from one of her pieces of research is the contamination that also has been found in the corners in terms of potentially mold, potentially different water sources and stuff like that. How would that contamination potentially affect the dating or even the need for the invisible reweave?
Yeah, I'm not sure it would in itself skew the date. It possibly would. I guess it depends on the cleaning techniques. The labs claim that they clean the samples, um, but I think the mold or contamination would have been more of a factor just from the aesthetic point of view. So,
Mm,
she seems to think that the invisible reweave would have kind of uh, done two tasks at once: fix the repair that was needed, and also make it more pleasing to the eye in terms of covering up the previous um, mold and contamination, so that you could no longer see it. So that's where
yeah,
I think she's coming from with that.
yeah. Well, and I think too, if there was, water in there or mold in there, that would also certainly, at least in my opinion, would weaken the cloth, potentially make it more likely to fray. And if it's more likely to fray, it's more likely to need to be repaired. And so
Hmm.
therefore, then the repair would be, more likely to have taken place just because it was more likely to have been damaged through the mold, through the water, and then through the handling that took place over the centuries.
Right. If your viewers want to check out some of Pam's papers, and just a note, they have a lot of pictures, so that they take a few minutes to is it download or upload?
Download,
Download.
yeah, download.
It takes a few minutes to download, but anyway, her site is www.shroudofturinexhibition.com. One word, shroudofturinexhibition.com. And she's got a lot of good papers there. And there's also a really good paper there by Donna Campbell of the Thomas Ferguson Limited, and her views on the fact that she thinks there was a repair there.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Pam has done some amazing stuff,
Mhm.
and then definitely one on there was one on the contaminations, and that was kind of what I was referring to. And she's found 7 different sources of contamination
Mhm.
that are probable based on the
Mhm.
history of the cloth and other markings that you can see on the cloth. All right, well, fantastic. Anything before we kind of talk about the infamous carbon 14 testing? Anything else we want to say about the invisible reweave?
Um, I again, I would there's just so many details. It's hard. I've been working on this theory off and on for 20 years. I did recently post on academia.edu my most recent version of the paper. I think it's like 66 pages, and I have 30 illustrations and about 90 references.
Mm,
So it's pretty up to date. I can't think of my link off the top of my head, but if you go to academia, and their search engine is not the best, and a friend
yeah.
of mine notified me this morning that their yearly fee just went up, I think, from 100 to 200, which I'm not thrilled about, considering Their
Yeah.
basic searching capabilities are not very good.
Well,
I
maybe
think,
they'll use that extra money to improve it, but you're so
I
right.
hope
It's
so.
very,
Yeah,
yeah. So
I think,
I guess on academia.edu, then search under Joe Marino and then invisible reweave, and I'm sure that that would come up with that paper, hopefully with their search engine.
I think what I can do is if people have trouble finding it, I'll give my email here, and they can email me, and I can send them the link. My email is jmarino240 at AOL.com. That's JMARINO 240 at AOL.com. So if people have trouble finding that link, just send me an email, and I'll send it to you.
Fantastic. And we'll repeat that link towards the end. All right, so let's get down to the infamous carbon-14 dating, and it's kind of interesting how the labs. It almost seemed like their purpose was to debunk the authenticity of the shroud, and in the meantime, there's been so many different things that testing did wrong. And there's been a ton of different discussions on various groups on Google, and it's just amazing as to everything that went wrong. Let's first talk about the sample and the sample taking. You mentioned there was some of the problems with that, but let's just go back and reiterate some of the problems that there were with the sampling, and how then the sample was then even sent out to the labs and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they had a big planning meeting in Turin in 1986, September 29th through October 1st. It was over 3 days. And the C14 people were invited, some people from STIRP were there, obviously the Italian authorities, an Italian group called I forget the name of it. It was an Italian civic group, and because even though the it belonged to the Catholic Church at that point, because it was something about Italian jurisdiction or something, an Italian group, civic group, was in it, and they made the people later during the C14 testing itself turn the lights down, and Rigi and other people were saying we could hardly see what we were doing. But I mean, it was a disaster from beginning to end. But they were supposed to establish a protocol back in that meeting in 1986, take it from multiple areas, multiple labs, and then they had several other protocols that they put forth. And then when it came time to take the sample on April 21st, 1988, they ignored everything that they had done, including the whole 3-day meeting in Turin. And Rigi and Ganella argued for an hour and a half where they were going to take the sample from. It's like, why did you have a 3-day meeting and now you're arguing the day of the sampling where you're supposed to take it from? So as I said, they only took the one sample because it was next to the Rhea sample, which had already been cut. Excuse me, already been cut. And then as I said, they gave the dates of the control samples to the labs. The labs were not supposed to consult with one another, but the evidence shows that they did. It was just a mess. And I attended a symposium in Rome in 1993, and there was a French statistician there named Philippe Boursier de Carbone, spelled Carbon, ironically. And he listed 15 points of failure in the procedures that the labs did. And I'm going to just read those real quick because these are important to hear. 1, absence of a formal report of the sampling. 2, absence of a video archive on the final steps of the sample's packaging. 3, in the official reports, contradictions about the cutting and weight of the samples by people in charge of sampling. 4, breaches of the protocol initially planned for the operation of dating. 5, rejection of the usual procedure of double-blind test. 6, refusal of the interdisciplinary documentation, which is usual in the procedures for radiocarbon dating. 7, exclusion of acknowledged specialists in the Shroud, particularly American scientists who participated in previous works of the Shroud of Turin research project. 8, communication to the laboratories, most unusual, of the dates of the control samples prior to testing. 9, intercommunication of results among the 3 laboratories during the job. 10, disclosure to the media of the first results before the delivering of the findings. 11, refusal to publish raw results of the measurements. 12, non-explanation of the unique isolation of the confidence interval of the measures performed by the Oxford laboratory compared to those made by other laboratories. 13, unacceptable value of 6.4 published in the journal Nature for the chi-squared statistical test on the results of the radiocarbon dosage of the Shroud. 14, rejection of any cross debate on the statistical measures performed. 15, rejection, absolutely uncommon, of the publication of the statistical expertise of this operation officially entrusted to Professor Bray of the G. Colonetti Institute of Turin. And Descarbone concluded, such a remark of deficiencies remains completely unusual in the context of a truly scientific debate, and one can only deplore this exception to the usual ethics. So I was able to write an 800-page book on the numerous problems.
And what's the name of that book, by the way?
It's called the 1988 C14 Dating of the Shroud of Turin, a Stunning Expose. It's on Amazon, and it's very reasonably priced. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to fit everything in, because more stuff would come out, more material. So I have a supplemental document on my academia page that has the overflow. And there's a link in the book that'll take you to that. And I have something like 80 additional entries that I added after the book was published. It's just,
that's one thing.
Amazing.
Yeah, it really is. But that's one thing I like about the this whole Shrouds, the sciences and the studying of what goes on, is that as new things come available, each one of these pieces of information needs to be updated. And I really like that, because it is true. It is truly, the science is almost living. And then to your point about your book and all of the 80 new entries that you have, it really makes a big difference to keep that record new and fresh, and and making sure that the science stays up with the recent findings.
Yeah.
So how were the 3 labs chosen? Because I thought initially in the protocol there were going to be more than 3 labs. How were they weeded down to just the 3? Was that also a kind of a last minute thing, or how did that take place?
Originally there were as many as 7 at one point, and of course they switched protocols left and right. So then it kind of came down to about 6. And the other 3, let's see, would have been Harwell in England, Brookhaven in the U.S., Brookhaven in the U.S., and Harry Gove's lab at Rochester. And Harwell and Brookhaven were the previous proportional counter method of C14, which required a larger piece, a handkerchief size piece. So they leaned toward AMS facilities because you could use a much smaller sample. And of course, the 3 that they picked, Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford, were AMS labs. But it's important to note that method was only really refined to the point where they started doing tests in in the late 70s, about 77. So the carbon dating was in 88. So the method was really only 11 years old when they did it. And even in that time period, they hadn't done that many datings on cloth. So it was, you can understand why they wanted to do it, doing just threads as opposed to bigger sections. But Harry Gove in Rochester, uh, he was the co-inventor of the AMS method, and he was he had a lot of influence in the dating with the labs that did do it, and he managed to. He didn't like STIRP. He thought they were a bunch of religious nuts, trying to prove the resurrection, which was not at all true. And then he locked horns with Ganella. And so one of the reasons Gove's lab didn't get picked, I think, was because Ganella didn't like him. So
who says there's no personalities in
no, my
science?
gosh, there were so many egos and politics and agendas and Machiavellian goings on. It's just mind-boggling for what should have been the most important scientific test in history, and it was just bungled from beginning to end. And let me tell you another story that I can't remember if I might have it in my supplement. I don't think I knew about it at the time when my book was published. But Michael Kowalski, the editor of the British Society for the Turin Shroud newsletter, he's written a book, a very good book, and he's been on some podcasts. He told an interesting story on a podcast recently that he was on, in that Nature magazine that published the report, the editor at the time was a guy by the name of John Maddox, and he was known to be militantly anti-Christian. And he was a fellow of the organization called the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. I think they've changed their name to something shorter right now. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But anyway, in 1987, John Maddox was a fellow of that organization, and Carl Sagan was also a fellow of that organization. And in 1987, they published in one of their magazines, I think it might have been the Skeptical Inquirer, maybe. Anyway, in the year before the carbon dating, they published a list of things that their organization intended to debunk. Okay. And guess what was on that list in 1987? The Shroud of Turin. The report is published in Nature magazine, which John Maddox is the editor of. Willie Wolfley was the head of the Zurich lab, and I've got a quote in my book where he says this was the first time in his life that he was involved in a project in which a paper was accepted before a draft was even submitted. Maddox apparently heard or knew that the data was showing at the time that it was putatively 1260 to 1390, which of course him as a fellow of PsyCop and an anti-Christian militant would have been happy about. So people tend to think that, scientists are honest, and there's a lot of dishonesty in science. But when you come to the Shroud of Turin, which is an emotional subject and has implications for people's worldview and outlook on life, it's to me, it's not surprising at all that people would try to manipulate the data to get a result that coincides with their worldview or whatever. So, I mean, you don't want to make accusations, but once you start putting all the data down and listing all that went on, you can't help but think that, well, look at what the
Yeah.
actions, what they said and did, and then make your own conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was when I read your book, the Carbon-14 Dating, a Stunning Expose, and I have the title probably wrong. I was amazed at the politics and the pettiness
Yeah.
of different people across the whole planning and the implementation
Yeah.
and everything of the carbon dating. In some respects, you could kind of say the killing of Jesus Christ was the greatest crime of all time, but the greatest crime in 1988 was the carbon-14 dating, because there was clearly things. It's not a crime necessarily, but over exaggerating, but clearly things that were done in an inappropriate manner, in a political manner, in a petty manner, and it's really a shame when you think about what actually happened afterwards once that took place, because it really slowed the scientific study of the shroud immediately thereafter. And it's only now, as the truth and as the problems and the 17 that you mentioned from Professor Carbone, as those things are now coming out and becoming more widely known, that the shroud research is now starting to take over again.
Yeah, and I'll tell you another interesting little story in terms of related to the fact that of the 15 I read, they said that the raw data wasn't released, and that's true. It was only finally released in 2017 after Tristan Casabianca of France filed a Freedom of Information Act. Now, why did it take that long to release it? You have to, conclude that they were worried about there being data in there that looked odd or suspicious. And once that data did come out, Tristan and three other Italian co-authors, including statisticians, found severe problems with the way that the labs compiled their statistics, and then it concluded with a 95% certainty that the shroud dated to 1260 to 1390. So a corollary to that story is that in shortly after the C14 dating, Teddy Hall of the Oxford lab retired from Oxford. And in March of 1989, so about 5 months after the dating, Hall retired, and the Oxford lab received a £1 million donation from anonymous rich businessmen. Now, they didn't say it was for debunking the shroud, but that's been a suspicion by many people. And guess who took Hall's place? It was Michael Tite from the British Museum, who was supposed to be the independent overseer. And by the way, Teddy Hall was on the board of directors of the British Museum. So you got some conflicts of interest there. That doesn't prove that they were manipulating things necessarily, but it doesn't look good that there was that two-way conflict of interest going on. And then I asked Tristan at a conference in Canada in 2019. I said to him, "Did you ever file a Freedom of Information Act to Oxford to get the names of the rich businessmen that made that £1 million donation?" And he told me at the time that he had filed it at the same time in 2017 that he did the Freedom of Information Act to the British Museum about the raw data. And I checked with him within the last couple months. Not only has he not gotten any information on that, he has not even received a reply that to his request. So they've completely ignored it. Again, so why are they
What do they
hiding
have to
this?
hide?
What do they have to
Yeah,
hide? Why are you not releasing
yeah,
this information? And I suspect that, if we see some of the names of those people, people might be able to find some connections and connect some dots that might lead to more interesting um,
yeah, yeah,
connections.
yeah,
You
absolutely.
know,
So we have the British Museum as kind of the organizer, and they do the summary of the results from each of the labs. So each of the labs got a sample. They did their dating. They provided their results to the British Museum, and the British Museum then is the one that summarized them and I guess published them. And then it was what Tristan Casabianca did to get the freedom of information to finally get the actual raw data
mm-hmm.
from the British Museum that was given to them from each of the different labs.
Right. And interestingly, in that list of 15 that I read by Carbone, he mentioned an institute in Turin called the G. Colonetti Institute. They were supposed to have gotten the same uh, data from the labs like the British Museum, but there was another change in the protocol. Only the British Museum got the data. Then they say, after they worked the data, they sent it to the Colonetti with their adjustments already done. And so in other words, the Colonetti weren't able to analyze the data to the degree that they would have been able to critique in the same way the data. So that's also just very suspicious, I think.
Yeah,
And I can't
yeah.
remember what the Colonetti actually concluded, but they were kind of shoved to the side. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences was supposed to be involved, and they were kind of pushed to the side. It was just one thing after another.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty amazing. It is really amazing in those 15 points. And then, the Tristan Casabianca was able to get that information from the Freedom of Information request. That to me is a game changer when you finally see the statistics and how they did that wrong, not to mention everything else that was done wrong, as Professor Carbone, pointed out. We've got a break. I could go on. I would love talking about this stuff, and then certainly the carbon-14 dating, to me one of the greatest crimes ever. In terms of how badly that was done, and then to your book as well, and pointing out the politics and the pettiness and everything else that was going on behind the scenes was just phenomenal. Anything else to talk about on that quickly, or and then we can close it off?
Well, it's like I probably I have a million things in my head when I get on these podcasts, and I want to get this out, and we only have an hour or whatever, and that's why I kind of prefer, as hard of the work it is to do an 800-page book, because I can go at my pace and recheck things and everything. But anyway, yeah, I really do suggest to people to get that book. It's not a thing you're going to read from cover to cover in a couple nights. I mean, it's more of a reference book. Another aspect to that is that if you buy the print book, if you're really interested in digging in, I will send people a free PDF of the book, so that'll supplement what's in the index. There is an index in the book, but if you want to get the electronic copy, you want to look up other things, you can, searching is much easier on an electronic copy. But yeah, it's interesting, and I think we've made good inroads. It's taken like you know 30 something years, 35 years to kind of get most of the story out. And I always point out that I wrote the book and did the 80 additional entries in my supplement with documents that I could get my hands on. Now, some of them are rare, I'll admit that, but I often think, gosh, there's probably a ton of information that I don't even know about that, if I knew about it, I might, have a 1,600-page book. Who knows? But there's plenty of evidence out there if you want to dig into it. Check out the book and
Yeah. And where can they reach you? What was your email again?
my email is jmarino 240 at AOL.com. jmarino240 at AOL.com. And I'll be happy to answer any questions and give you the link to my academia page if you want that. Oh, I might also mention here, I have a weekly email bulletin to which I send people interested in the Shroud the latest news and podcasts and videos and articles. I like keeping up on that. And I usually come up with 6 to 12 items a week all year round.
It's more than that. You've got more than that. It's just incredible and that's where the interest in the Shroud is documented by how many different items that you have. There are so many papers as well as podcasts and videos and interviews and stuff like that. So Joe, let's close it off there if you wouldn't mind. So jmarino240 at gmail.com, jmarino240.
No, AOL.com.
At AOL, sorry, AOL.com. Thank you very much. And then otherwise to the audience, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin, and please visit Guy Powell and sign up for more episodes. And if you have some suggestions as to topics or individuals you'd like me to or us to interview, please let me know. And Joe, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's always very interesting and very educational.
Thanks, Guy. I really appreciate the video cast that you do. You have some great guests, and it's a great service to the Shroud people that are interested in this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, thank you.